My mother filed for guardianship, claiming I was incapacitated. I went through 6 psychiatrists who attested to my sanity, but she appealed 7 times, and the process has lasted 3 years. The official envelope from the court arrived on a Thursday morning when I was preparing coffee while mentally organizing that day's professional agenda, including an important meeting with strategic clients. The meeting was with strategic clients of the financial consulting firm I've directed for 8 years, building a solid reputation based on technical competence, and above all, on absolute reliability that was now being systematically destroyed by absurd legal proceedings alleging I was mentally incapable of managing my own life or assets. When I opened that envelope with slightly trembling hands, I discovered it was notification about the 7th consecutive appeal my own mother had filed after the 6th independent psychiatric report categorically confirmed what all 5 previous ones had already established. The reports had established this unequivocally through exhaustive evaluations, including standardized cognitive tests, extensive clinical interviews, complete medical history analysis, and above all, direct observation of my exemplary professional functioning. Coordinating a team of 15 professionals, managing a corporate client portfolio, representing annual movement exceeding $5 million in specialized consulting. I was absolutely mentally sound without any indication of psychiatric disorder, cognitive deterioration, or decisional incapacity that remotely justified the absurd interdiction request. The absurd interdiction request that Sonia had maliciously initiated 3 years before was based exclusively on fabricated allegations about erratic behavior supposedly observed during family visits that in reality had never happened in the distorted way she systematically described in successive legal petitions. My 41 years of existence, meticulously built on foundations of university education in administration, completed with academic honors, ascending professional career developed through competence consistently demonstrated over 18 years working progressively in positions of increasing responsibility. I eventually established my own successful consulting firm, stable marriage with Daniel for 13 years based on mutual respect, and above all on honest communication about challenges faced both personally and professionally, and above all on the comforting certainty that I knew perfectly the reasonable limits of maternal behavior, even when occasionally conflictual, due to generational differences about life choices. All of this crumbled abruptly on that sunny Tuesday morning exactly 3 years before, when a court officer rang my doorbell personally delivering notification about the interdiction process. The interdiction process initiated by Sonia formally alleged before the court that her professionally successful adult daughter was mentally incapacitated, necessitating appointment of a legal guardian to manage personal life, and above all, financial assets accumulated through years of honest work that was now being coveted through a manipulative legal maneuver disguised as legitimate maternal concern about the welfare of a supposedly vulnerable daughter. The word interdiction carries devastating legal weight that instantly transforms an autonomous adult person into an individual legally equivalent to a minor or severely mentally incapacitated person. This completely strips fundamental rights to make decisions about one's own life, including medical choices, financial transactions, personal relationships, and above all, basic bodily autonomy that democratic societies universally presume as an inalienable right of competent adults, except when irrefutable medical evidence demonstrates genuine incapacity to exercise rational judgment about consequences of one's own actions. The interdiction process should theoretically be a compassionate tool intended to protect genuinely vulnerable people due to severe psychiatric conditions, progressive dementias, or substantial intellectual disabilities. These conditions fundamentally compromise capacity for self-care and informed decision-making. But unfortunately, it can be perverted into a manipulative legal weapon used by ill-intentioned family members seeking to control assets, exercise power over adult relatives through coercive judicial mechanisms, or above all, satisfy pathological psychological needs to dominate other people's lives through legal authority, granted by courts deceived through false allegations convincingly presented by skilled manipulators. The first time I read Sonia's initial petition requesting my complete interdiction based on allegations about erratic behavior, the allegations included supposed uncontrolled emotional outbursts during family dinners, imprudent financial decisions compromising my own economic stability, and potentially affecting future family inheritance, progressive social isolation distancing myself from healthy family relationships through growing paranoia about intentions of close relatives, and above all, demonstrated incapacity to maintain stable professional relationships, as evidenced by frequent job changes during recent years. I simultaneously experienced absolute disbelief about the audacity of those lies fabricated so elaborately, and above all, frozen terror about the possibility that the court might believe those false narratives. This could result in catastrophic loss of personal autonomy through appointment of a legal guardian controlling every aspect of my independent adult life. Each specific allegation contained in that malicious petition was a grotesque distortion of objective reality easily refutable through documentary and testimonial evidence. Uncontrolled emotional outbursts were actually appropriate verbal confrontations, where I established healthy boundaries against Sonia's manipulative behaviors during increasingly tense visits. Imprudent financial decisions were successful strategic investments in consulting expansion, generating substantial returns, validating the wisdom of business choices. Social isolation was conscious reduction of contact with toxic family members, while simultaneously maintaining a robust network of genuine friendships and respectful professional relationships, and job changes were natural career progression culminating in establishment of my own business instead of professional instability, indicating psychological compromise. Daniel was working remotely in the home office when I received that first judicial notification 3 years before, and I immediately ran to share with him the absurd document I had just received from the hands of a uniformed officer who observed my growing confusion with the neutral professional expression characteristic of people accustomed to delivering devastating news. The officer was accustomed to delivering devastating news to ordinary citizens whose lives are being irreversibly transformed by incomprehensible legal processes. Daniel meticulously read Sonia's entire initial petition during tense silence that extended for 15 minutes while he mentally processed each false allegation, occasionally pausing to reread particularly absurd sections with an expression that alternated between incredulity and growing fury about the deliberate cruelty of a mother initiating such a devastating legal process against her own daughter based exclusively on systematically fabricated lies. When he finally finished complete reading of the 23-page document, the document detailed supposed evidence of my alleged mental incapacity, Daniel carefully placed the paper on the office desk, removed his reading glasses, rubbing tired eyes, and pronounced with controlled voice but obviously loaded with contained emotion the words that would echo repeatedly during the following 3 years of exhausting legal battle. This is deliberate war disguised as maternal concern, and we will fight tirelessly using all available legal resources to expose the falsity of these malicious allegations before they cause irreparable damage to your professional reputation, and above all, to your fundamental personal autonomy. The first weeks after receiving notification about the interdiction process were frantically dedicated to hiring specialized legal representation in family law, and above all, in defense against abusive interdiction. Processes that unfortunately were not as rare as society generally imagined, considering that legal mechanisms intended to protect the vulnerable were regularly perverted into tools of manipulative family control by psychologically disturbed individuals seeking to dominate adult relatives through coercive judicial authority. Adriana was recommended by a lawyer colleague specializing in business law who occasionally collaborated with my consulting firm. The colleague occasionally collaborated on complex contractual matters, and during the first consultation in a modern office located in a discreet commercial building, she patiently listened to my rushed narrative about a historically conflictual relationship with Sonia that had progressively deteriorated during recent years as I established an independent life increasingly distant from controlling maternal influence. She methodically explained the legal interdiction process, including mandatory psychiatric evaluation stages, possibilities of contestation through independent medical reports, and above all, warned about the devastating emotional complexity of publicly defending oneself against allegations of mental incapacity made by one's own mother. She warned about defending oneself before a court that would initially presume good faith of a concerned family member instead of malicious manipulation by a person seeking to control assets, or simply satisfy pathological psychological needs to exercise power over the life of a successful adult daughter. The first psychiatric evaluation ordered by the court was conducted by Dr. Fernando, an experienced 53-year-old professional who regularly worked as a judicial expert in interdiction cases, impartially evaluating mental capacity of people whose autonomies were being legally questioned by family members or other interested parties. During 3 exhausting hours seated in a discreetly furnished office, I answered detailed questions about personal history from childhood to present, performed standardized cognitive tests evaluating memory, logical reasoning, planning capacity, and above all, judgment about consequences of hypothetical decisions, and finally described the relationship with Sonia, including recent escalation of conflicts that culminated in that absurd legal process. Dr. Fernando maintained a professionally neutral expression, characteristic of psychiatrists trained not to demonstrate premature judgments during clinical evaluations that require absolute objectivity. 2 weeks after that initial session, I received a copy of the detailed expert report of 12 pages, the report that Dr. Fernando had formally submitted to the court, and each technical paragraph written in precise medical language categorically confirmed what I obviously already knew about my own mental sanity, but which needed to be officially established through judicially recognized psychiatric authority. The patient demonstrates absolutely normal cognitive functioning, as evidenced by exemplary performance in all administered standardized tests, maintains appropriate insight about objective reality without any indications of delusions or perceptual distortions characteristic of psychotic disorders, exhibits clear capacity for logical reasoning about consequences of personal and financial decisions, including appropriate planning for the future considering multiple relevant factors. The patient presents consistent professional history demonstrating technical competence, and above all, interpersonal skills necessary to coordinate teams and maintain lasting commercial relationships with demanding clients, and conclusively presents no evidence of mental incapacity that would justify interdiction procedure as requested in the initial petition analyzed during this independent expert evaluation. I naively believed that the first categorical psychiatric report, attesting to my complete mental sanity, would be sufficient to immediately end the absurd interdiction process initiated by Sonia, allowing return to normal life focused exclusively on professional responsibilities and healthy personal relationships. Instead of battles consuming emotional energy, and above all, substantial financial resources, paying growing legal fees as the process extended inexorably through the bureaucratic judicial system. But Adriana realistically warned during a meeting celebrating the favorable report that Sonia probably would not accept that first result, contrary to her interests, and would most likely file legal appeals questioning the methodology of the psychiatric evaluation, alleging expert bias due to possible influence from me through paid fees even though it was an official court appointment, or above all, requesting additional evaluation by a different professional, hoping to obtain a more favorable result. The result would be more favorable to the false narratives she had systematically constructed about my supposed mental incapacity. Adriana's somber predictions were devastatingly confirmed only 2 weeks after Dr. Fernando's favorable report was officially presented to the court, when we received notification about the first appeal filed by Sonia's lawyer, contesting the validity of that psychiatric evaluation through technical arguments, questioning insufficient time dedicated to clinical interview, absence of consultations with close family members who could provide additional perspectives about problematic behaviors allegedly not revealed during single session with expert. The appeal above all suggested that a person with elevated intelligence as demonstrated by cognitive tests could easily mask subtle psychiatric symptoms during brief evaluation, deceiving even experienced professionals, through carefully controlled presentation that did not reflect real functioning in stressful everyday contexts. The circular logic of the arguments in Sonia's first appeal was simultaneously absurd and disturbingly persuasive because it transformed each evidence of my mental competence into supposed additional proof of sophisticated dissimulation capacity that would only confirm need for deeper investigation, instead of simply accepting obvious conclusions based on exemplary performance. The conclusions were based on standardized evaluations and, above all, on documented history of successful professional functioning over decades. The court accepted the appeal arguments, ordering a second psychiatric evaluation by a different expert this time, including obligation to interview close family members and professional colleagues to obtain multiple perspectives on my functioning in various social contexts. A decision that initially filled me with apprehension about the possibility of Sonia manipulating narratives during interview with the second expert. But Adriana reassured me, explaining that experienced professionals were trained specifically to identify inconsistencies between reports from different sources. They were trained above all to value objective evidence, such as documented professional performance, above subjective allegations from family members potentially motivated by financial interests or pathological relational dynamics. The second psychiatrist appointed by the court was a 49-year-old woman specialized in forensic evaluation, with a reputation for almost obsessive thoroughness, conducting exhaustive investigations before formulating definitive conclusions about mental capacity of people involved in complex legal processes. During 5 sessions distributed over 3 weeks, she interviewed not only me, repeatedly exploring in detail each aspect of my cognitive and emotional functioning, but she also interviewed Daniel, describing our marital relationship and, above all, my capacity to make joint decisions about family finances and future planning. Marcia, providing perspective of close friendship consistently maintained during 15 years, witnessing my emotional stability through various life challenges. 3 important consulting clients attesting to professional competence and reliability, consistently demonstrated through years of successful commercial collaboration. And finally, Sonia, presenting her distorted version about allegedly problematic behaviors she supposedly observed during increasingly rare family visits, as I established healthy boundaries against emotional manipulations, characteristic of her relational style. The final report of the second psychiatrist was even more detailed than the first, totaling 28 pages of meticulous technical analysis, but the conclusion remained unchanged, categorically confirming through more exhaustive methodology what the first expert had already established unequivocally. There is no objective evidence of mental incapacity that would justify interdiction procedure, and the petitioner's allegations about problematic behaviors are not corroborated by other independent sources, nor consistent with exemplary professional functioning documented through business records and testimonies of satisfied clients, maintaining lasting commercial relationships based on trust and technical competence. They trusted above all in the strategic judgment of the evaluated party. The devastating revelation contained in that second equally favorable psychiatric report should have definitively ended that absurd interdiction process that Sonia had maliciously initiated 6 months before, but instead of accepting that second categorical professional confirmation about my complete mental sanity, my mother filed a second, even more elaborate appeal, questioning not only the methodology of the evaluation, but above all, suggesting a coordinated conspiracy between judicial experts potentially bribed to produce favorable reports, protecting a rich and professionally well-connected daughter. This was supposedly protecting me against an elderly mother legitimately concerned about the welfare of a person clearly incapable of recognizing her own progressive cognitive deterioration. The audacity of that second appeal, alleging bribery of experts officially appointed by the court itself, was simultaneously legally absurd and emotionally devastating, because it transformed each procedural victory into a moral defeat where I needed to constantly defend not only my mental sanity, but above all my ethical integrity, against progressively more serious accusations systematically fabricated by a person who should know me intimately enough to understand that I would never commit crimes. I would never commit crimes like corruption of judicial authorities to escape legitimate psychiatric evaluations if I were genuinely mentally incapacitated, as she persistently alleged. During a tense meeting with Adriana discussing implications of that second appeal, my lawyer patiently explained that courts generally tolerated multiple appeals in interdiction processes, specifically because the legal mechanism was theoretically intended to protect genuinely vulnerable people, whose mental incapacity might prevent them from adequately defending themselves. So judges preferred to err on the side of caution, ordering additional evaluations instead of prematurely closing processes, potentially leaving truly incapacitated people without necessary protections. But she warned that Sonia's excessive persistence would eventually work against her, demonstrating procedural bad faith instead of legitimate maternal concern about my welfare. The third psychiatrist appointed by the court after the second appeal was accepted was a 62-year-old man specialized specifically in detecting simulation and dissimulation during forensic evaluations, a professional whose reputation was based on an almost legendary capacity to identify people faking mental incapacity to obtain Social Security benefits or escape criminal responsibilities, but also in detecting highly functional individuals, masking genuine psychiatric symptoms through carefully controlled presentations. These presentations occurred during brief clinical sessions that did not adequately capture functional deterioration experienced in stressful everyday contexts outside artificially structured and safe medical environments. During 6 exhausting sessions distributed over 5 weeks, that third expert applied an even more extensive battery of neuropsychological tests, evaluating not only basic cognition, but above all complex executive functions, including long-term strategic planning, cognitive flexibility facing contradictory information, capacity to inhibit inappropriate impulses in socially sensitive contexts, and above all, moral judgment about ambiguous ethical dilemmas that did not have objectively correct answers. But these dilemmas revealed sophistication of moral reasoning characteristic of psychologically mature adults versus childish simplifications typical of people with significant cognitive impairment. Additionally to those standardized tests, the third psychiatrist requested permission to observe me directly in a natural professional environment during a typical workday at the consulting firm, accompanying meetings with clients, supervision sessions with team members, and above all, stressful moments responding to unexpected business crises that required quick decision. Making under pressure considering multiple conflicting factors simultaneously. This experience initially filled me with anxiety about being observed like a scientific specimen. but it eventually provided irrefutable evidence about my exemplary professional functioning impossible to falsify or mask during 8 consecutive hours of complex business activities requiring technical competence and, above all, sophisticated interpersonal skills. The final report of that third psychiatrist was a 43-page document representing the most exhaustive analysis than any forensic evaluation Adriana had seen during 20 years practicing family law, and each detailed section confirmed through multiple independent methodologies, converging to identical conclusions what 2 previous experts had already categorically established. The evaluated party demonstrates cognitive functioning significantly above the population average as evidenced by performance. The performance was in the 98th percentile in fluid and crystallized intelligence tests, exhibits exceptional executive capacities including sophisticated strategic planning and adaptive flexibility facing unexpected challenges, maintains appropriate insight about complex social realities without perceptual or interpretive distortions characteristic of psychotic or cognitive disorders, and above all demonstrates through direct observation in natural professional environment, unequivocal functional competence, coordinating teams, managing delicate commercial relationships, and making strategic business decisions under pressure that would be absolutely impossible for a person experiencing any significant form of mental incapacity alleged. This was alleged in the initial interdiction petition analyzed during this independent expert evaluation. The technical conclusion of that third report included an additional paragraph that the 2 previous ones had not dared to pronounce explicitly, but which that veteran expert with decades of forensic experience felt comfortable stating categorically based on substantial evidence accumulated during exhaustive investigation. The interdiction petition filed by the petitioner has no factual foundation based on genuine medical condition of the evaluated party, and the pattern of progressively more elaborate allegations, despite multiple independent evaluations, confirming complete mental sanity strongly suggests that the legal process represents abuse. This represents abuse of the legal system theoretically intended to protect the vulnerable but perverted in this specific case into a tool of manipulative family control for reasons that transcend the scope of this psychiatric evaluation, but which deserve additional investigation by appropriate authorities, including potentially professional ethics counsel, if the petitioner is being inadequately advised by legal representation, encouraging frivolous and manifestly unfounded litigation. Adriana celebrated that third report as definitive procedural victory that would finally end the judicial nightmare that had consumed 18 months of my life, and above all, substantial financial resources exceeding $100,000 paying growing legal fees, costs of multiple increasingly elaborate psychiatric evaluations, and above all, loss of professional revenue due to time dedicated to preparations for hearings and meetings with lawyers. Instead of focusing exclusively on business responsibilities managing the consulting firm during an economically challenging period where clients demanded constant attention maintaining competitive commercial relationships in a saturated market of financial consultants competing for valuable corporate contracts. But again, I underestimated Sonia's pathological persistence, and above all, the malicious creativity of her lawyer, elaborating progressively more convoluted legal arguments, questioning validities of favorable evaluations through procedural technicalities. These technicalities did not address substance of medical conclusions, but focused exclusively on supposed procedural irregularities that allegedly invalidated methodologies applied independently of how categorical final findings were about my irrefutable mental sanity exhaustively, documented through 3 independent evaluations, unanimously converging to same conclusions about exceptional cognitive competence, and above all, about exemplary professional functioning, impossible to reconcile with any significant form of mental incapacity, justifying interdiction procedure. The third appeal filed by Sonia after the third equally favorable psychiatric report alleged that observation in professional environment had been methodologically inadequate. This was because the consulting firm was a relatively small business, where I exercised absolute control over presentations to the expert, potentially rehearsing interactions with clients and team members in advance to create false impression of competence that did not reflect real functioning in contexts where I did not have opportunity to control environmental variables or prepare elaborately for specific situations being evaluated. Above all, it claimed that absence of consultations with extended family members beyond Daniel represented a substantial investigative gap because family members who had known me since childhood could provide historical perspectives about progressive deterioration over decades that evaluations focused exclusively on current functioning would not adequately capture. The tortuous logic of those arguments in the third appeal revealed Sonia's growing desperation facing evidence systematically accumulated, refuting each malicious allegation she had originally made about my supposed mental incapacity, but simultaneously demonstrated worrying legal sophistication, suggesting that her lawyer was either genuinely convinced by the distorted narrative she presented about a successful adult daughter hiding cognitive deterioration through elaborate dissimulations, or was cynically exploiting a psychologically vulnerable client through prolonged litigation generating substantial fees independently of fundamental legal merits of the absurd case. The case persisted inexplicably through a judicial system too tolerant of frivolous appeals and interdiction processes. The court again accepted arguments of the third appeal, ordering a fourth psychiatric evaluation, this time specifically including obligation to extensively interview members of the extended family, including Ricardo, my younger brother, who had remained strategically neutral during the entire process, avoiding publicly taking sides between mother and sister in increasingly acrimonious legal conflict. Maternal and paternal uncles who maintained distant but cordial relationships with me through occasional interactions at annual family gatherings, celebrating important holidays. And above all, childhood colleagues who theoretically could attest to my cognitive and emotional development during formative years before establishing independent professional career, that Sonia maliciously alleged was an elaborate facade, masking fundamental incapacity. The prospect of having dozens of people from my past and present being interviewed by a forensic psychiatrist, investigating allegations about my supposed mental incapacity, was simultaneously publicly humiliating and emotionally terrifying, because I could not control narratives that each person would choose to share based on subjective memories potentially distorted by decades of selective forgetting, or above all, by conflicting family loyalties where some might feel pressured to support Sonia. They might feel pressured by relational obligations, even if they objectively recognize the absurdity of her allegations about my compromised mental sanity, creating an impossible situation where personal and professional reputation, meticulously built during 4 decades, was being subjected to devastating public scrutiny by a person who should protect me instead of systematically destroying me through malicious legal processes. The fourth psychiatrist appointed by the court was a 57-year-old woman specialized in complex family evaluations involving disputes about mental capacity where motivations of different parties were frequently obscure and potentially conflicting. This professional's methodology was based on building comprehensive psychological profiles through extensive interviews. These interviews were with complete social networks of evaluated people, instead of relying exclusively on standardized tests or limited clinical sessions that captured only artificial fragments of real functioning in natural contexts where complex interpersonal relationships revealed dimensions of personality and competence impossible to access through structured formal evaluations. During 3 exhausting months, that fourth expert conducted 47 individual interviews with people from my past and present, including not only close and distant family members, but also university professors who had supervised academic work decades before, colleagues from previous jobs witnessing consistent career progression through multiple organizations before establishing my own consulting firm, long-term clients describing lasting commercial relationships based on trust in technical competence and strategic judgment repeatedly demonstrated through years of successful collaboration, and above all, neighbors and casual acquaintances providing perspectives on everyday social functioning in informal contexts outside professional environments, where I supposedly masked incapacity through carefully controlled presentations, as Sonia persistently alleged. Ricardo finally broke strategic neutrality during interview with the fourth psychiatrist, revealing to Adriana afterwards that he had honestly described a historically functional family relationship between me and Sonia until approximately 2 years before, when our mother began manifesting growing resentments about my financial independence. And above all, about establishment of healthy boundaries against controlling behaviors that had characterized her maternal style during our childhood, but which I no longer tolerated as an autonomous adult with my own family and successful career, not dependent on maternal approval or financial support. Contextualizing the interdiction petition as probable revenge for loss of control over adult daughter instead of genuine concern about cognitive deterioration that objectively did not exist based on decades of close fraternal observation. Ricardo's courageous testimony providing honest relational context about family dynamics underlying the interdiction process was complemented by interviews with maternal uncles. They discreetly shared their own concerns about Sonia's mental state during recent years, manifesting growing paranoia about alleged family conspiracies against her, progressive social isolation after my father's death 5 years before leaving her a lonely widow, repeatedly resisting suggestions to participate in community activities for seniors, or seek therapeutic support processing complicated grief. And above all, intensive involvement in online forums about grandparents' rights, where she apparently internalized toxic narratives about adult children alienating elderly parents through psychological manipulations intended to control family inheritances or simply exercise cruel power over the emotionally vulnerable. This was for incomprehensible sadistic satisfaction. The progressive revelations during those 47 interviews conducted by the fourth expert gradually built a comprehensive psychological profile, not only of me but above all of Sonia, completely inverting the original narrative of the process, where a successful adult daughter was allegedly incapable, necessitating a legal guardian to replace compromised judgment about vital decisions, transforming the situation into a family tragedy, where an elderly mother possibly experiencing her own cognitive deterioration or psychological disorder projected anxieties about growing vulnerability into distorted accusations against a daughter functioning exemplarily. But she was establishing healthy autonomy that threatened pathological psychological needs for absolute maternal control, developed during decades of dysfunctional relationship, finally confronted through appropriate boundaries that a mature adult had the right to impose, protecting her own welfare and nuclear family. The final report of that fourth psychiatrist was an 89-page document representing the most exhaustive analysis of complex family dynamics that Adriana had encountered during her entire career practicing family law. And the report structure differed significantly from the 3 previous reports, because it dedicated substantial sections not only to categorically confirming my complete mental sanity through convergence of multiple independent sources. These sources attested to exceptional cognitive and functional competence, but above all to critically analyzing psychological motivations underlying the interdiction petition, strongly suggesting that Sonia might be projecting her own anxieties about aging and growing vulnerability into distorted allegations about incapacity of a daughter who objectively presented no evidence of mental deterioration, justifying such an invasive legal procedure so destructive of fundamental autonomy. The technical conclusion of that fourth report explicitly recommended that the court consider definitively archiving the interdiction process based on overwhelming evidence accumulated through 4 independent evaluations, unanimously converging to identical conclusions. The conclusions were about the unquestionable mental sanity of the evaluated party, but additionally suggested that Sonia herself should be subjected to psychiatric evaluation, investigating possible delusional disorder or cognitive deterioration, manifesting through obsessive legal persecution against an exemplarily functioning daughter. This extraordinary recommendation completely inverted the procedural dynamic, transforming the person initiating the interdiction request into a potential object of legitimate medical concern about compromised mental capacity, justifying protective interventions instead of continuing to pursue manifestly unfounded allegations against a victim of abusive litigation clearly intended to control instead of protect. Adriana celebrated that fourth report as absolute procedural victory that would finally expose Sonia's manipulations before the court, forcing the judge to recognize the abusive pattern of frivolous litigation, and above all, to seriously consider protective measures against my mother, preventing additional appeals without presentation of substantially new evidence, instead of simply recycling previously refuted arguments through progressively more convoluted procedural technicalities. But she realistically warned that courts moved extremely slowly in interdiction processes, and that we would probably face additional months of hearings before definitive resolution, even with 4 categorical reports unanimously converging about my irrefutable mental sanity. And above all, about Sonia's evident procedural bad faith, persisting obsessively despite evidence systematically accumulated refuting each malicious allegation. Adriana's somber prediction about additional procedural prolongation was devastatingly confirmed when Sonia filed a 4th appeal questioning the methodology of that 4th evaluation, alleging that interviews with family members had been conducted in a biased manner because the expert supposedly demonstrated favorable bias toward me based on previous professional relationship with Adriana that obviously did not exist, but which Sonia's lawyer maliciously fabricated through distortions about casual collaborations at legal conferences years before. Both had participated as speakers on related but non-overlapping topics, an absurd allegation that Adriana easily refuted through documentation, demonstrating complete absence of any personal or professional relationship with the 4th expert beyond her public reputation as a nationally recognized authority in forensic evaluations of mental capacity. The emerging pattern through those 4 successive appeals revealed a deliberate strategy by Sonia and her lawyer to indefinitely prolong the process through technically sophisticated but substantially empty appeals, intended exclusively to wear me down emotionally and above all financially through legal costs, inexorably accumulated as litigation extended through years instead of months. I had initially expected, when I naively believed that the first categorical psychiatric evaluation would be sufficient to end the judicial nightmare maliciously initiated by a person who should protect me, instead of systematically destroying me through progressively more elaborate allegations about mental incapacity that 4 independent experts had unanimously refuted through multiple methodologies converging to identical conclusions about unquestionable sanity and exemplary professional functioning, impossible to reconcile with any form of cognitive impairment, justifying interdiction. During a dramatic judicial hearing 27 months after initial notification about the absurd interdiction process, I finally confronted Sonia directly for the first time. This was the first time since the beginning of that Kafkaesque nightmare, when both of us were summoned to personally appear before the judge responsible for the case, to answer direct questions about motivations, underlying the inexplicable procedural persistence despite overwhelming evidence accumulated through 4 forensic evaluations, unanimously converging about my complete mental sanity. It was a cathartic moment where years of repressed frustration about the fundamental injustice of that impossible situation exploded through intense verbal confrontation that finally revealed complex emotional dimensions of a dysfunctional maternal relationship culminating in destructive litigation. Seated in a formal hearing room austerely furnished with dark wooden benches, and above all, an elevated table where the judge presided with intimidating judicial authority, I observed Sonia for the first time in more than 2 years, noting revealing physical transformations. Her gray hair, previously impeccably arranged, now slightly disheveled, suggesting personal neglect characteristic of people under substantial psychological stress. Cold blue eyes that I remembered as calculating now, demonstrating a restless quality, and above all, frightened of someone confronting unexpected consequences of impulsive choices, initially imagined as strategic victories, but progressively revealed as moral defeats inexorably accumulated through a legal process that had completely escaped original control. The process was transforming into public exposure of pathological motivations instead of validation of legitimate maternal concerns as she had naively anticipated. The judge initiated the hearing reading a factual summary of the process, particularly emphasizing the extraordinary convergence of 4 independent psychiatric evaluations, categorically confirming the mental sanity of the respondent through multiple methodologies including standardized tests, extensive clinical interviews, direct observation in natural professional environment, and above all, consultations with dozens of people providing diverse perspectives on cognitive and social functioning over decades. She concluded that preliminary summary with a direct question for Sonia about what additional evidence she possibly believed. What additional evidence could refute the unanimous conclusions of 4 forensic experts recognized as authorities in their respective specialties, impartially evaluating mental capacity of people whose autonomies were legally questioned by concerned or potentially ill-intentioned family members? Sonia remained in visibly uncomfortable silence for long seconds, processing that direct judicial question that required a substantive answer, instead of procedural technicalities that her lawyer had successively employed through 4 appeals, avoiding confronting the fundamental reality that medical evidence overwhelmingly converged against original allegations about my supposed mental incapacity. And finally, with trembling voice loaded with contained emotion, she pronounced words that finally revealed psychological motivations underlying that absurd process. My daughter transformed into a person I no longer recognize after marrying and establishing her own business, progressively distancing herself from me through allegedly healthy boundaries, but which I experience as cruel rejection after decades dedicated to raising her, sacrificing my own professional ambitions to guarantee education and opportunities that she took advantage of, building an independent life where she no longer needs me, nor values maternal advice based on life experiences that she should respect instead of arrogantly ignoring. Sonia's emotional confession, revealing resentments about growing autonomy that I had appropriately established. I had established this as a mature adult-confirmed analysis of the 4th psychiatrist about dysfunctional relational dynamics underlying the interdiction process, and the judge responded with a remarkable combination of judicial firmness and human compassion, patiently explaining that establishment of healthy boundaries by adult children against controlling relational patterns did not constitute cruel rejection, justifying retaliation through destructive litigation, falsely alleging mental incapacity, but rather appropriate development of psychological autonomy, characteristic of emotional maturity, that parents should celebrate instead of combating through legal mechanisms, perverted into tools of family control, instead of genuine protection of the vulnerable. As originally intended for interdiction procedures established to safeguard people genuinely incapacitated from managing their own lives due to severe medically verifiable cognitive impairments, instead of simply inconvenient for family members desiring to exercise power over others' decisions. The judge concluded that dramatic hearing by definitively archiving the interdiction process, based on overwhelming evidence of 4 evaluations unanimously converging about my irrefutable mental sanity, but additionally ordering that Sonia submit herself to her own psychiatric evaluation, investigating possible underlying disorders, motivating obsessive legal persecution against an exemplarily functioning daughter, and above all, imposing a temporary restraining order. The order prevented my mother from initiating any additional litigation against me during a minimum period of 2 years, allowing reconstruction of family relationship through supervised therapeutic mediation. If both of us eventually desired reconciliation instead of permanent rupture resulting from her destructive choices initiating a manifestly unfounded legal process that had caused substantial emotional and financial damages during 3 years of exhausting battles. The sensation of absolute relief when the judge formally pronounced definitive archiving of the process was simultaneously emotionally liberating and relationally devastating, because legal victory represented public confirmation of mental sanity that should never have been questioned. But it also meant probably irreparable rupture with a mother whose malicious choices had destroyed fundamental trust, characteristic of healthy family relationships, based on mutual respect instead of attempts at control through coercive legal or psychological mechanisms, leaving me finally free from abusive litigation, but simultaneously emotionally orphaned from a maternal relationship that had existed only superficially, masking pathological dynamics, finally publicly exposed through a legal process that Sonia had arrogantly initiated expecting to obtain control over life and assets I had built independently, but achieving only public humiliation of revealing motivations. During the following months after that definitive archiving, I intensively dedicated myself. I dedicated myself to reconstructing dimensions of life that had been neglected during 3 years consumed by exhausting legal battles. My relationship with Daniel, who had remained unwaveringly supportive, but obviously worn by prolonged stress of living under constant threat of losing marital autonomy if interdiction were granted, appointing a legal guardian controlling decisions about family finances, and above all about fundamental vital choices that mature couples make collaboratively, based on mutual trust instead of through external legal authority coercively imposed. My consulting firm had survived the tumultuous period, but lost important clients uncomfortable with association to a person publicly involved in interdiction process, suggesting instability, even if unfounded. And above all, my own emotional health devastated by the necessity of repeatedly defending sanity during 3 years against progressively more elaborate allegations maliciously fabricated by a person who should love me unconditionally instead of attacking me through destructive litigation, satisfying pathological psychological needs for absolute control over independent adult life that threatened maternal ego based on distorted perception of children as controllable extensions, instead of autonomous individuals deserving of fundamental respect about legitimate vital choices even when divergent from parental expectations formed during childhoods, where control was appropriate but becoming progressively inappropriate as children matured, transforming into competent adults. Competent adults deserving of full autonomy, legally recognized and above all emotionally respected by family members who genuinely loved instead of simply desired to control through various manipulations, including ultimately attempts at judicial stripping of fundamental legal capacity through absurd interdiction processes. The gradual reconstruction of my life after that definitive judicial archiving required conscious daily efforts confronting traumas accumulated during 3 years defending mental sanity against progressively absurd allegations maliciously fabricated by a person who should protect me. And above all, processing complicated grief about loss of maternal relationship that had never genuinely existed, as I had naively imagined. But it had always been a dysfunctional dynamic based on her controlling needs instead of unconditional love, characteristic of healthy family bonds respecting individual autonomy, independently of choices divergent from parental expectations, established unilaterally without considering legitimate desires of adult children deserving of fundamental self-determination about their own vital trajectories. Daniel demonstrated extraordinary patience during those first post-process months while I navigated conflicting emotions about legal victory that publicly confirmed never genuinely questionable sanity, but simultaneously cruelly exposed Sonia's pathological motivations transforming a superficially functional family relationship into a devastating judicial battlefield. Revealing uncomfortable truths about the manipulative nature of maternal bonds I had tolerated during decades, rationalizing controlling behaviors as excessive concern instead of recognizing evident signs of disturbed personality, incapable of respecting healthy boundaries appropriately imposed by a mature adult, establishing independent life, threatening to maternal ego, pathologically based on absolute control over others' existences. Individual therapy with a psychologist specialized in complex family traumas was fundamental for processing emotional dimensions of that judicial nightmare that transcended simply legal victory over false allegations, exploring above all dysfunctional relational patterns established during childhood, where I unconsciously learned to tolerate Sonia's emotional manipulations. Through adaptive strategies like superficial conformity, masking growing resentments that finally exploded when I established healthy boundaries as a married, professionally successful adult, no longer dependent on maternal approval to validate legitimate vital choices. Precipitating disproportionate retaliation through interdiction process, essentially representing judicial punishment for audacity of claiming fundamental autonomy that healthy mothers would celebrate instead of destructively combating through abusive litigation. During initial therapy sessions, I emotionally resisted characterizing Sonia through formal psychiatric diagnoses, preferring more benevolent explanations about destructive behaviors as simply adaptive difficulties of elderly women facing loneliness after widowhood, and above all loss of relevance as children established independent lives, reducing contacts to occasional polite but emotionally distant interactions. But the therapist gently confronted those defensive rationalizations, pointing out that a person genuinely concerned about daughter's welfare would not initiate a malicious legal process specifically intended to strip her of fundamental legal autonomy through allegations systematically fabricated about mental incapacity, categorically refuted by 4 independent forensic evaluations, unanimously converging about unquestionable sanity and exceptional functioning, impossible to reconcile with distorted narratives persistently presented, despite overwhelming contrary evidence. The gradual acceptance that Sonia probably suffered from an undiagnosed personality disorder manifesting through pathological needs to control others' lives, and above all, fundamental incapacity to tolerate autonomy of close people experienced as unbearable rejection justifying disproportionate retaliation, was simultaneously emotionally liberating because it absolved me of inappropriate guilt about relational deterioration that objectively resulted from her choices instead of my failures establishing healthy boundaries. But also devastating because it confirmed impossibility of genuine reconciliation with a person psychologically incapable of respectfully relating to an autonomous adult daughter, unless I subjected myself again to controlling patterns that would sacrifice my own welfare. And above all, my nuclear family tolerating destructive manipulations indefinitely, instead of protecting mental health through appropriate distancing from toxic relationships, independently of blood bonds traditionally presumed as unbreakable. Ricardo maintained regular contact with me during the post-judicial emotional reconstruction process, repeatedly expressing guilt about strategic neutrality he had maintained during most of the litigation, avoiding publicly confronting Sonia, despite privately recognizing the absurdity of her allegations about my supposed mental incapacity, explaining that he feared similar retaliation if he challenged her distorted narratives, but had finally gathered courage to honestly testify during the 4th psychiatric evaluation, providing crucial relational context that had helped reverse the procedural dynamic exposing pathological motivations underlying the manifestly unfounded interdiction request, and above all offering unconditional fraternal support during the reconstruction period, belatedly recognizing moral responsibility to protect his sister against maternal abuses instead of preserving false appearances of family neutrality facing evident injustices. Reconciliation with Ricardo was a gradual process built through honest conversations about dysfunctional family dynamics that both of us had experienced during childhoods marked by excessive maternal control, but processed differently based on distinct genders and personalities. He had developed strategies of superficial conformity, avoiding direct confrontations, preserving an apparently functional relationship with Sonia through acquiescence to her expectations about career and vital choices, while I had progressively established autonomy challenging to maternal ego, incapable of tolerating independence of a daughter, no longer controllable through traditional emotional manipulations. Precipitating escalation of coercive tactics, ultimately culminating in attempt at judicial stripping of legal capacity through absurd interdiction process, essentially representing extreme punishment for unforgivable transgression of claiming fundamental self-determination about my own adult life. The consulting firm gradually recovered from reputational damages caused by public association with interdiction process that some clients erroneously interpreted as evidence of potential instability threatening commercial relationships, fundamentally based on trust about technical competence, and above all, reliable strategic judgment during complex business decisions substantially affecting corporate assets managed through specialized consulting, requiring proactive transparency efforts where I selectively shared with important clients context about abusive litigation maliciously initiated by a disturbed family member instead of reflecting any genuine incapacity of mine categorically confirmed through multiple independent forensic evaluations, unanimously converging about exceptional mental sanity and exemplary professional functioning, exhaustively documented during prolonged judicial investigations finally concluded through definitive archiving, with explicit recommendations that the person initiating the process should herself submit to psychiatric evaluation, investigating underlying disorders motivating manifestly unfounded obsessive legal persecution. Clients who remained loyal during the tumultuous period became valuable allies, providing enthusiastic references for potential new contracts, emphasizing not only technical competence, consistently demonstrated through years of successful collaboration, but above all, extraordinary resilience, maintaining exceptional professional standards while simultaneously navigating devastating personal legal battles that would have destroyed less determined or competent people, transforming potentially prejudicial narrative about involvement in interdiction process into testimony about strong character, and above all, demonstrated capacity to function exemplarily under extreme pressures, validating instead of questioning reliable strategic judgment during business crises requiring calm leadership focused on practical solutions instead of uncontrolled emotional reactions characteristic of genuinely incapable people, as Sonia had falsely alleged during 3 years of frivolous litigation, obsessively persistent, despite evidence systematically accumulated, refuting each malicious allegation progressively fabricated. Marcia remained an unwaveringly loyal friend during the entire judicial nightmare, and above all during the post-process reconstruction period, offering not only emotional support through constant availability for conversations processing accumulated traumas, but also valuable perspective of external observer who had casually known Sonia during years through occasional social interactions at family events where her manipulative behaviors were evident to attentive people, even when superficially masked through performances of concerned mother instead of pathological controller, incapable of tolerating autonomy of adult daughter, establishing independent life appropriately distant from toxic maternal influence that would sacrifice her own welfare, tolerating destructive manipulations indefinitely instead of protecting mental health through healthy boundaries courageously imposed, despite inevitable relational costs, breaking dysfunctional family bonds based on control instead of genuine respectful love of fundamental self-determination. The decision about whether to eventually respond to Sonia's requests for supervised therapeutic mediation, as suggested by the judge during process archiving, remained a complex question that I periodically revisited through conversations with therapists exploring motivations underlying possible reconciliation, carefully distinguishing between genuine desires to restore healthy relationship based on mutual respect versus inappropriate social obligations about preserving family bonds independently of costs to own emotional welfare, tolerating abusive behaviors simply because perpetrators were blood relatives traditionally presumed as deserving of unconditional loyalty, even when repeatedly demonstrating incapacity to respectfully relate with appropriate boundaries. Imposed by autonomous adults establishing independent lives legitimately distant from parental controls, progressively inappropriate as children matured, transforming into competent individuals deserving of self-determination about their own vital trajectories. Sonia's psychiatric evaluation, ordered by the court as condition for eventual reconciliation, revealed diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, with paranoid features manifesting through pathological needs to control close relationships, and above all, fundamental incapacity to tolerate autonomy of significant people, experienced as unbearable rejection, justifying disproportionate retaliation, intended to restore control, perceived as inalienable right over others' lives independently of legitimate desires, of autonomous individuals deserving of respect about their own vital choices, confirming analyses of the fourth forensic expert who had suggested investigation of possible underlying disorders motivating obsessive legal persecution against an exemplarily functioning daughter through absurd interdiction process, essentially representing attempt at judicial stripping of fundamental autonomy punishing unforgivable transgression of establishing independent life, challenging to maternal ego pathologically based on absolute control over others' existences, narcissistically perceived as extensions of herself instead of separate people deserving of self. Determination. The psychiatrist who conducted Sonia's evaluation recommended intensive treatment combining psychotherapy focused on developing capacities to respectfully relate with others' boundaries and, above all, low-dose antipsychotic medication, managing paranoid symptoms that had been exacerbated by participation in toxic online forums about grandparents' rights, where conspiratorial narratives about adult children maliciously alienating elderly parents were systematically amplified, creating echo chambers, radicalizing psychologically vulnerable participants through collective validation of distorted perceptions, progressively transformed into delusional convictions, justifying destructive actions against family members, objectively functioning in healthy ways, but subjectively experienced as intolerable threats to pathological needs, for absolute control over close relationships independently of legitimate desires, of autonomous people deserving of fundamental respect about their own vital choices, even when divergent from parental expectations unilaterally formed without considering self-determination of competent adult children. Sonia initially resisted treatment recommendations alleging that psychiatric diagnosis was additional conspiracy, orchestrated by me through influence over supposedly corrupt professionals willing to fabricate false evaluations, protecting rich, well-connected daughter against vulnerable elderly mother, courageously denouncing genuine mental incapacity hidden through elaborate dissimulations. But eventually reluctantly acquiesced after her lawyer warned that refusal of judicially ordered treatment would result in legal consequences, including possible interdiction process against herself based on demonstrated incapacity to recognize objective reality about daughter's mental sanity, categorically confirmed through 6 independent forensic evaluations, unanimously converging about exceptional cognitive competence and exemplary professional functioning impossible to reconcile with distorted narratives. She obsessively persisted, believing despite overwhelming evidence, refuting each malicious allegation systematically fabricated during 3 years of manifestly unfounded, frivolous litigation. Sonia's progress in psychiatric treatment was initially slow, marked by substantial resistances to confronting cognitive distortions about nature of our family relationship, and above all about motivations underlying healthy boundaries that I had appropriately established. As a mature adult, instead of cruel rejections as she had narcissistically interpreted through pathological incapacity to distinguish between legitimate autonomy and malicious abandonment. But gradually, through months of intensive therapy combined with medication stabilizing paranoid symptoms, she began demonstrating partial insights about controlling patterns that had characterized her maternal style during decades, creating dysfunctional dynamics. Finally, confronted through legal process, she had arrogantly initiated, expecting to obtain validation of allegedly legitimate concerns, but achieving only public exposure of pathological motivations, revealing underlying psychological disorders, needing treatment instead of confirmation of allegations about incapacity. Of a daughter objectively functioning in exemplary ways, exhaustively documented. Approximately 18 months after archiving of the interdiction process, Sonia formally requested through her therapist a supervised mediated meeting by professionals specialized in family reconciliations after severe conflicts, expressing desires to rebuild relationship based on mutual respect, belatedly recognizing errors of judgment, initiating destructive litigation motivated by pathological needs for control, instead of genuine concerns about my welfare, and above all, offering apologies for emotional and financial damages caused during 3 years of exhausting legal battles that nearly destroyed professional reputation, meticulously built through decades of honest, dedicated work. Establishing successful consulting firm, managing substantial corporate assets based on clients' trust about technical competence and strategic judgment, consistently demonstrated through years of lasting commercial collaboration, validating exceptional capabilities instead of incapacities falsely alleged. The decision to accept or refuse that mediation request was extremely difficult, requiring careful consideration of multiple conflicting factors, including genuine desires to eventually restore some form of functional family relationship with mother, now recognizing errors through psychiatric treatment versus legitimate needs to protect own emotional welfare, and above all, nuclear family against possible relapses of manipulative behaviors if Sonia interrupted treatment, or regressed to previous controlling patterns threatening to mental health that I had sacrificed during decades, tolerating manipulations instead of imposing appropriate boundaries, protecting fundamental self-determination about own vital choices, legitimately divergent from parental expectations, unilaterally formed without considering desires of competent adult daughter, deserving of respect about professional trajectory, and above all, personal relationships, established independently of maternal approval, no longer necessary nor desired as validation of mature decisions. Daniel offered balanced perspective during discussions about accepting mediation with Sonia, recognizing legitimacy of my desires to eventually rebuild functional maternal relationship, but prudently warning about needs to establish clear boundaries. Protecting nuclear family against possible future damages if Sonia demonstrated sustained incapacity to respect our autonomy through relapses to controlling or manipulative behaviors characteristic of personality disorders, notoriously resistant to treatments, despite intensive psychiatric interventions, providing partial improvements, but rarely complete transformations of dysfunctional relational patterns established during decades of pathological functioning, reinforced through occasional successes, manipulating close people through emotional guilt. Tripping or above all implicit abandonment threats intended to restore controls narcissistically perceived as inalienable rights over others' lives, independently of legitimate self. Determination of autonomous individuals deserving of fundamental respect. After extensive consultations with my own therapist and above all honest conversations with Daniel about potential risks and benefits of reconciliation with Sonia, I cautiously decided to accept the supervised mediation request establishing clear conditions, protecting emotional welfare through explicit boundaries about frequency of contacts, initially restricted to monthly therapeutic sessions during minimum probationary period of 6 months before considering casual interactions outside professionally supervised contexts. And above all, maintaining complete distancing from financial matters, where Sonia would not have access to information about assets or business decisions, eliminating temptations to revert to controlling patterns. Through manipulations about supposed material concerns that had partially motivated the original interdiction process, essentially representing attempt at judicial stripping of fundamental autonomy directly controlling finances, through legal guardianship coercively imposed based on fabricated allegations about mental incapacity. The first supervised mediation session occurred in a neutral therapeutic environment, facilitated by a psychologist specialized in complex family reconciliations, where Sonia presented herself visibly aged and above all emotionally fragile, compared to the image I mentally retained of a confident controlling woman, orchestrating manipulations through presumed unquestionable maternal authority. Revealing substantial personal costs. Of the legal process she had arrogantly initiated expecting quick victory, validating distorted narratives about daughter's incapacity, but progressively facing humiliating public exposure of pathological motivations, through 4 forensic evaluations unanimously converging about my exceptional mental sanity and above all about her psychological disorders, needing intensive treatment instead of confirmation of allegedly legitimate concerns about welfare of person objectively functioning exemplarily through irrefutable documentary evidence exhaustively accumulated during 27 months of absurd litigation obsessively persistent. During that first mediation, Sonia pronounced with trembling voice, loaded with conflicting emotions, the words that represented the most explicit recognition. Until then, about errors committed initiating destructive process. I now recognize through prolonged psychiatric treatment that I initiated interdiction litigation, not because I genuinely believed you were mentally incapacitated, as I alleged in legal petitions elaborated by the lawyer, who inadequately encouraged me to persist despite evidence accumulated to the contrary, but fundamentally because I could not tolerate loss of control over your life as you established growing autonomy through successful marriage, and above all, independent professional career, where you no longer needed my approval or financial support, validating choices that I narcissistically experienced as intolerable rejections instead of appropriate developments. Of a mature adult daughter deserving of self-determination about her own vital trajectory, legitimately divergent from expectations I had unilaterally formed about how you should live satisfying my needs instead of your legitimate desires. That honest confession by Sonia, recognizing pathological motivations underlying the legal process, was simultaneously emotionally validating because it confirmed that my intuitions about the manipulative nature of the litigation were correct instead of paranoid, as she had suggested during years of progressively escalating conflicts. But also painful because it explicitly revealed that the maternal relationship I had naively imagined as founded on genuine love, even when occasionally dysfunctional, was in reality based primarily on her controlling needs instead of respect for my individuality deserving of fundamental autonomy, independently of conformity to narcissistically formed parental expectations without considering legitimate desires of competent adult daughter, establishing her own life appropriately distant from toxic family influences that would sacrifice welfare, tolerating manipulations indefinitely instead of protecting mental health through healthy boundaries, courageously imposed despite inevitable relational costs. The supervised mediation sessions continued monthly during the following year, providing safe space to process dysfunctional family dynamics that had culminated in destructive litigation, and above all, to gradually establish healthier relational patterns based on mutual respect. Instead of unilateral controls characteristic of previous interactions, where Sonia exercised presumed maternal authority over decisions that were not appropriately her business involving adult life, of autonomous daughter deserving of privacy about personal choices, and above all, professional ones not requiring parental approval for validation of mature judgments consistently demonstrated through documented successes, building successful consulting firm, managing substantial corporate assets based on clients' trust about technical and strategic competencies, validating exceptional capabilities instead of maliciously alleged incapacities during 3 years of absurd legal processes, finally definitively archived. Sonia demonstrated genuine progress through that year of mediations, and above all, continued psychiatric treatment. Gradually developing partial capacities to relate more respectfully with boundaries, I established protecting family autonomy, and above all, belatedly recognizing that healthy maternal relationship with adult daughter required accepting herself. Determination about her own vital choices instead of persisting in attempts to control through emotional manipulations, or above all, coercive litigation, intended to judicially strip her of fundamental legal capacities, exercising authority over decisions that were appropriately exclusively hers, as a competent person functioning exemplarily through irrefutable evidence, exhaustively documented during multiple forensic evaluations, unanimously converging about exceptional mental sanity impossible to honestly reconcile. With distorted narratives she had maliciously constructed justifying manifestly unfounded interdiction process, pathologically motivated by controlling needs instead of genuine concerns. Gradual reconciliation with Sonia remained a delicate process, requiring constant vigilance about signs of possible regressions to previous manipulative patterns, and above all, firm maintenance of clear boundaries protecting own welfare and nuclear family against potential damages if she interrupted treatment or demonstrated sustained incapacity to respect autonomy appropriately established through healthy distancing from maternal influences that were legitimately reduced to occasional polite contacts instead of intensive involvements characteristic of dysfunctionally enmeshed relationships. Where lack of differentiation between separate individuals created pathological dynamics impossible to maintain without sacrificing fundamental self-determination, deserving of protection through boundaries courageously imposed, despite inevitable relational costs, establishing appropriate priorities, valuing own mental health above inappropriate family obligations, tolerating abusive behaviors, simply because perpetrators were blood relatives traditionally presumed as deserving of unconditional loyalty. 3 years after that devastating envelope containing Sonia's 7th appeal that had finally been denied, definitively ending the most prolonged and emotionally destructive judicial nightmare of my life, I finally achieved genuine sense of inner peace, processing accumulated traumas through intensive therapy, and above all, rebuilding vital dimensions neglected during period consumed by exhausting legal battles, defending mental sanity against progressively absurd allegations maliciously fabricated by person who should protect me, and honestly reflecting on devastating but ultimately transformative journey, I recognize that although interdiction process had caused substantial emotional and financial damages that took years to completely repair, it also provided definitive clarity about dysfunctional nature of maternal relationship I had tolerated during decades, rationalizing controlling behaviors as excessive concerns instead of recognizing evident signs of pathological disorders, incompatible with healthy bonds based on mutual respect. The most valuable lesson I extracted from that devastating experience was deep understanding about importance of establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries in family relationships, independently of social or emotional costs associated with distancing from toxic relatives. Recognizing that blood bonds do not confer automatic rights to control others' lives, nor obligations to tolerate abusive behaviors, simply because perpetrators are family members traditionally presumed as deserving of unconditional loyalty. And above all, that self-determination about one's own vital trajectory represents fundamental right of competent adults, deserving of respect about personal and professional choices legitimately divergent from parental expectations. unilaterally formed without considering individual desires of autonomous people, establishing independent lives appropriately distant from family influences that would sacrifice own welfare, tolerating destructive manipulations indefinitely, instead of protecting mental health through courageously imposed boundaries, prioritizing legitimate needs above inappropriate obligations, preserving dysfunctional relationships incompatible with healthy psychological functioning. Today, I coordinate an even more successful financial consulting firm than before the legal process, partially because clients value not only technical competence consistently demonstrated, but above all, extraordinary resilience maintaining exceptional professional standards while simultaneously navigating devastating personal battles that validated instead of questioned capacities. To function exemplarily under extreme pressures requiring reliable strategic judgment during business crises, and relationship with Daniel strengthened through shared adversities, confirming his unwavering solidarity during the most difficult period of my life, when fundamental autonomy was threatened through interdiction process that would have completely stripped rights to make decisions about my own life if Sonia had succeeded in deceiving the court through fabricated allegations about mental incapacity that 4 independent forensic evaluations categorically refuted, unanimously converging about exceptional sanity and exemplary professional functioning, exhaustively documented validating competencies, instead of maliciously alleged incapacities. During 3 years of absurd litigation, obsessively persistent. Did you enjoy Beatrice's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.